अगर प्राइवेट सेक्टर बैंक में खोलोगे तो वो आपका अकाउंट घर आकर के खोलेंगे, अगर आप पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक में जाओगे तो वो कहेंगे लंच के बाद आना।
Oh, I got your point. Welcome to the first episode of the A&P show, where we break down the world of banking into simple and understandable terms. I'm your host Kunal Arora and my co-host Sandeep Pyana.
And in today's episode, we'll be answering some of the most common banking related queries.
So whether you are a seasoned banker or just started your financial journey, this episode is for you. So Sandeep, my first ask is, like, for our audience, we should explain how banking emerged in India.
Okay, so जो सबसे पहला बैंक फॉर्म हुआ था, एस्टैब्लिश हुआ था, दैट वाज इन 1770s, बैंक ऑफ हिंदुस्तान इन कैलकाटा, and it operated for almost 50 years, and in 1832 it was shut down.
Okay.
And then one more bank was formed, uh, General Bank, and it was formed in 1786 and shut down in 1791.
Okay.
And then three major banks emerged in between 1800 and 1850s: Bank of Bengal, Bank of Bombay, and Bank of Madras.
Okay. So were there were only these three banks at that moment?
No, pre-independence there were almost 600 banks that emerged, but only few were able to survive.
Okay. So is there any bank prevailing right now which was there in pre-independence? If you give any reference.
I think SBI was the one. Bank of Bengal, Bank of Madras, and Bank of Bombay were later merged into one entity, Imperial Bank, in 1921.
Okay.
And these three banks the Imperial Bank was basically renamed as State Bank of India in 1955.
So the amalgamation of these three banks formed SBI, which we know as State Bank of India right now.
Right.
Okay.
So these three were the presidency banks. These three were called presidency banks at that time.
Okay. So my next ask is, you mentioned that there were three cities. Okay. So why only these three cities were considered while opening a bank?
So the three banks, Bank of Bombay, Bengal, and Madras, were opened by British East India Company.
Okay.
And the specific cities were chosen because Britishers, these three cities were basically the center of power in separate regions for British East India Company.
Okay, so ruling India for them, and they chose these three places that because the trade route was there, everything was
Right,
there,
right.
ports were there.
Right.
Okay, I got your point. Okay, so now after independence, were there any banks regulatory body which came into play?
Okay, so in 1949, Banking Regulations Act was formed, and RBI was also formed. And RBI was given regulatory power over banks and to set up the basic framework for banking operations.
Okay, so RBI is the regulatory body now.
Right.
Okay, so you just mentioned about the private sector bank, I believe. So RBI controls only the private sector banks or the public bank as well?
RBI is regulatory body for every bank in India, private sector banks or public sector banks.
Okay, so RBI is not a bank; it's just a regulatory body.
Right.
Okay, so for my audience, can you please explain the difference between public sector bank and private sector bank, ताकि जो बच्चे हमारा एपिसोड अभी देखेंगे उन लोगों को ये पता हो कि प्राइवेट सेक्टर बैंक्स कौन से होते हैं और पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स कौन से होते हैं.
So private sector banks are owned and operated by private entities like you, me, or big private entities, whereas public sector banks are owned and operated by either state government or by central government.
Okay, सो इफ आई टॉक अबाउट प्राइवेट सेक्टर बैंक, अगर मैं प्राइवेट सेक्टर बैंक की बात करूं, तो क्या प्राइवेट सेक्टर बैंक में गवर्नमेंट का कोई रोल नहीं होता?
नहीं, एक्सेप्ट फॉर द आरबीआई गवर्निंग द बैंक।
ओके। तो मैं अगर चाहूं तो क्या मैं बैंक में अकाउंट खोल सकता हूं, और आप मेरे को क्या सजेस्ट करेंगे कहाँ खोलना चाहिए?
देखो, अगर प्राइवेट सेक्टर बैंक में खोलोगे तो वो आपका अकाउंट घर आकर के खोलेंगे। अगर आप पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक में जाओगे तो वो कहेंगे लंच के बाद आना।
I got your point. So let's meet after a lunch break then.